Hi everyone, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna discuss about Catasetum type orchids and how to care for them. Now these guys are really easy to care for. I think they're well suited for orchid beginners as well, and if I could do decently well with them, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't either. But there are a few things that you need to know and understand about them in order for them to thrive for you. So if you know the basics, everything should be smooth sailing. So let's talk about the basic care of Catasetum orchids. Now before we go into temperature, light, and all of that, I'll talk about the life cycle of these orchids because they do have a pretty distinct growth pattern and everything revolves around that pattern. So the first thing you need to know about them is that they are deciduous orchids. This means that they lose their leaves at some point. Some species or varieties lose the leaves after they bloom, some right before they bloom. There is a bit of variation depending on the species or variety, but for the main part they will lose their leaves usually after the blooms are done, and usually this happens in the fall. After the orchid loses its leaves, it will have a dormant period. The amount of time this orchid stays dormant again will vary depending on species or variety, but they do have a dormancy period in which the orchid will not look alive. It will lose its leaves and you'll be left with only the bare canes. After the dormancy period is over, the orchid will start to produce a new growth, which usually arises from the last pseudobulb created, but it's not a rule. Older pseudobulbs can create new growths as well. This usually happens in the spring, but again it's not a rule. Now this growth will develop very fast compared to other orchids, so in about 6 to 9 months you will have another mature pseudobulb, which will bloom and then it will lose its leaves and start to go dormant, and then it will grow again and practically the cycle will repeat itself. Okay, so now that we know their growth cycle, let's take each of these phases and see how to care for them in every state we can find them. So let's start with the dormancy period. As I told you, the orchid will start to lose its leaves, usually after the blooms are done. The leaves will start to go yellow one by one. Usually they start from the base of the pseudobulb and advance towards the tip of the pseudobulb. And eventually in a few weeks your orchid will remain bare. When you see the leaves start to yellow and fall, this is your cue to reduce watering gradually. If the orchid still has blooms, keep watering it, but if the orchid doesn't have any blooms, you can really reduce watering at this point. The pseudobulbs will usually tell you. If they start to shrivel very bad, give them a little bit of water, but if they look okay, you practically shouldn't water almost at all. When all the leaves have fallen, this orchid really does not need any more water. Again, if the pseudobulbs get really shriveled, give it just a little bit of water, a little spraying perhaps to plump them and not desiccate them to death, but other than that, you really shouldn't water this orchid. Temperatures while this orchid is dormant can be intermediate, so they really don't need low temperatures. So if you cannot provide cool temperatures during its dormancy or winter time, don't worry. This orchid really does not need such a low drop in temperature or a drop in temperature at all. It can do very well in intermediate temperatures while it's resting. Now this rest period can last from a few weeks to a few months, maybe 3 months. It depends on the orchid and on the individual, on the species, and so on. 1 year this orchid can stay dormant for 3 months, and the next year it can stay dormant for 2 weeks. Environment maybe plays a role as well. In any case, don't worry if the dormancy period will vary. Now when this orchid had enough sleep, it will start to produce a new growth. This usually appears at the base of a pseudobulb. As I said, usually it happens on the last pseudobulb created, so practically the pseudobulb from last year, but older pseudobulbs can produce new growths as well. At first the growth will look like a nubbin. This, however, does not mean that you need to start watering your orchid. The nubbin will start to develop and transform slowly into a leafy growth and will start to produce roots as well. Now the rule is that when the roots reach about 10 centimeters in length, you can start to gradually increase watering. Now this issue is a bit confusing for some people. A thing that I've noticed is that the roots, when they appear and they grow, they don't start to absorb moisture right away. My cue to start watering is actually the roots themselves. So you will notice at the beginning, if you spray the top of the media a little bit, that the new roots do not absorb moisture. They don't necessarily change color. At some point, when they reach a certain length, you will notice when you water a certain change in color. They will get a little bit darker. And it's easy to see that they're actually consuming the moisture. So at this time, what I did was I started to water a little bit more. So I didn't only spray the top top of the media, I just flushed the pot a little bit with water. I didn't soak the pot or anything, but I did run water through the pot. After about 2 or 3 weeks since I started to water the orchid, I started to fertilize the orchid as well. Now, this orchid has a very fast growth rhythm. This pseudobulb matured in 6 months for me. So from February until August, this is how long it took for this one to fully grow. So you can imagine that it does need a high quantity of water as well as fertilizer to fully develop. So what I did was I fertilized this orchid every time I watered with a high nitrogen fertilizer, and once a month at least I flush the entire pot just so I flush out the accumulations of salts. Now, all through summer, I kept watering this orchid, and you will see as the orchid produces more and more roots that it will start to drink water like crazy. And this orchid was watered once every 2 to 3 days once it actually filled the pot with roots. So at some point, you will need to water this orchid like mental, not let the media go completely bone dry, and keep fertilizing it every time you water, and with a flush of the pot once a month, I would say. When the pseudobulb is mature, you will notice that there will be no more leaves created from the top. At this point, I actually observed a flower spike developing from in between one of the set of leaves. Now, the flower spike can come either from the top of the pseudobulb, as you can see here, or from the bottom. Depends on the orchid and individual. I've seen Catasetum orchids with flower spikes right on the top or quite at the base of the orchid. So anything is possible, it just depends on the genetic of the plants. Now, the flower spike will take about a month and a half to fully develop and actually bloom, so it actually moves pretty fast. During this time, I actually switched to a bloom booster. Although I don't know if this actually helped, I piped down a bit on fertilizing, but I kept this orchid evenly moist still, so it can have enough energy and moisture to fully open the blooms. If you don't keep this orchid well hydrated while it's producing the flower spike, some buds might blast. And I have a case, 2 of the buds blasted because at some point I did leave it a bit too dry. So with this orchid, it's better to keep it evenly moist or more moist rather than dry. Now, depending on the variety or species, the blooms usually last for about 3 weeks, a month or so. During this time, this orchid might start to lose some of the leaves, or it might not start to lose any leaves at all. But usually when the blooms are done, this orchid will start to lose its leaves again, time in which you need to gradually reduce watering once again, stop fertilizing altogether, and practically the whole cycle will start all over again. Temperature-wise, this orchid received pretty warm temperatures. It is actually an intermediate to warm-growing orchid. While it was dormant, it received about 17-18 degrees Celsius, and it handled them pretty well. But yes, during summertime, it was really warm. I would say 28-29 degrees Celsius, and this orchid performed really well. The light for this orchid has to be bright. I would say Camellia orchid. If you can provide direct sunshine in the morning hours, that would be great. And for the remainder of the day, just give as much bright light as possible. So maybe use some sheer curtains. If you have just dappled light, I think that will be okay for it as well. But too strong sunlight can burn the leaves because they're a bit flimsy. They're not the most sturdy leaves you've ever seen. Also, it is said that bright light induces male flowers. If you didn't know, this orchid can produce a flower spike with female flowers, which do not have any pollen, and male flowers, which hold pollen. Now, the difference in appearance is supposed to be quite big, and usually male flowers are showier than female flowers. I didn't test this enough to know if this is the case, but it is said that bright light actually induces male flowers. In any case, I would try to give this orchid as bright light as possible. As I was saying, it has pretty much Camellia orchid light requirements. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about potting media. Now, since this orchid is a big drinker, I actually used a mixture of 50% sphagnum moss and 50% bark, and it's not enough. I think next year I'll go full sphagnum moss, but I will provide ventilation as well. Like all orchids, if it's suffocated and not ventilated enough in the pot, the roots might rot, and you don't really want that. So you want to try to find a media which is airy, provide a pot which is airy, but if you can add a more water retentive media, this will make life much easier, because you will not believe how much water this orchid can drink. It's actually pretty obvious. Look how huge it can be. Now, repotting this orchid should usually be done when the orchid breaks dormancy. So when you observe that a nubbing starts to form and you know it's not a flower spike, you can go ahead and repot this orchid. It's usually best to do this now before the new roots start. The old roots kind of have a tendency to die off. Many of them will die off and the orchid will rely on the new root system. So you need to take care of that new root system. So it's better to repot it once a year, especially if you use sphagnum moss, which degrades pretty fast, especially if you keep it moist as this orchid requires. So when you see the new growth starting, go ahead and repot the orchid before the new root system starts to emerge. You can repot the orchid after you see the new roots start as well, but you need to be careful not to damage them. As I was saying, they are the future of this orchid. Okay, about some other details you might not know about this orchid. As you can see, my orchid seems to be a little dirty, and I have to admit, it is. The cause of this is that this orchid produces an amazing amount of sap on its leaves, and it gets really sticky, and even if you shower it and clean them, they will appear after a while. So everything, dust, if you have a dusty environment, everything will stick to the orchid like crazy. So maybe you can place this orchid somewhere where it's not very dusty, otherwise you will get all of the dust really stuck on it and it's gonna be hell to remove it. Now, this particular one is a Cycnotus Wine Delight. It is a hybrid between a Cycnotus and a Marmotus orchid. I do have a spotlight on this orchid, so you can check the annotations on the screen right now and learn more about this particular one. In the back, I have the famous Millennium Magic Witchcraft. It is not producing a bloom at the moment, but this one is a little late. That one started to grow before this one. Also, this one suffered a shipment this year. It was sent to me this year. I'm not sure if this one will bloom, but you can see the difference in size. Usually, if the new pseudobulb is smaller than the older pseudobulb, this means that the orchid has been through some sort of stress. It might not bloom that year. So the rule is that the new pseudobulb created has to be at least as big as the older pseudobulb. But if it's smaller, that's a pretty bad sign to have. So that's why I'm saying this orchid might not bloom this year. As you can see, this pseudobulb is quite smaller than this one. It doesn't mean the orchid is not healthy. It just means it's building up energy, and hopefully next year it will produce a flower spike, if not this year actually. As you might notice, I didn't mention anything about humidity. These orchids, they're said to prefer over 40% humidity, but in my balcony it was even drier than this, and I really didn't have too much trouble with it. The main thing is to keep them hydrated at all times. And as a last note, depending on the species or variety you might have, these orchids can be quite fragrant. This particular one has such an intense and strong scent that it actually fills my balcony and my house. Luckily for me, I do like the smell of this one, but I know people who don't like the smell. It's a pretty striking smell, but other Catasetum type orchids can smell different. So read up before you buy it and see if it's fragrant or not. Also, be careful that most of them trigger pollen, and if you watch the video where I present this particular one, you will see how this orchid triggers and actually throws away its pollen. This is harder to trigger actually because it does not have hairs. Some Catasetums do have tiny little hairs, and even if you do this to the flower, it will eject the pollen. This is not the case for the Cycnotus Wine Delight. You need to struggle a bit to touch a particular part of the flower for it to trigger the pollen. But this can happen, so be careful, don't move it too much when it's in bloom or you might trigger the pollen. And when the pollen is triggered, the orchid will lose the flower. Okay everyone, so I hope you enjoyed this video. These were the basic care requirements for Catasetum type orchids. As I was saying, I find them to be really easy to care for as long as you understand their life cycle and of course their needs. And other than that, everything should be very easy. So if you've enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up and share it with your orchid friends. If you'd like to see more videos from me, simply subscribe to my channel. I post on a daily basis. Also, feel free to leave me questions or suggestions for videos in the comments section below and I'll get back to you. If you click on the left side of your screen, you'll be directed to orchidnature.com, where you'll find care sheets, identification sheets, and also you can talk to us in the forum section. And on the right side of your screen, you can click to watch another orchid video. Thank you for joining. I'll see you next time. Bye!